Hi, and welcome to Live Free to TV today. We have three great guests today. Our first guest is Mr. Roy Williams. Our second guest via Skype is Dr. Stephen Moose, and he's with the University of Illinois Champaign Crop Science Department. And Mr. Roy Williams is a PhD student at Dartmouth in the Molecular and Cellular Biology Program, Department of Genetics, and Department of Biomedical Data Sciences, the Giselle School of Medicine at Dartmouth College. And via telephone, we have Dr. Theodore Heimowitz. He is a professor emeritus in soybean biology at the University of Illinois Champaign. So thank you for joining us today. So what I would like to do first is to get a little bit more background on each of our guests. And I'll start with Mr. Roy Williams. Can you tell us a few key points about yourself and why you're interested in your passion in biology?
I'm a retired dairy farmer, and after maybe 20 years on the farm, I decided to try to do something that was maybe contribute more to the world. So I took up the biology program because I had an interest in veterinary medicine issues. And that has just led me from one thing to another. So here we are.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So next we'll go to Dr. Moose. Would you please tell a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I've been involved in agriculture my entire life. I grew up on a small dairy in Northeast Ohio. I've studied plant genetics and biotechnology for more than 20 years, and mostly with corn, but more recently with grasses that are dedicated for bioenergy. I teach a course here at the university and have for the last 15 years on biotechnology and agriculture, where we talk about the science, the commercialization process, and then impacts to agriculture and society. And my research uses these tools to basically try to improve crops for nutrition, sustainability, and yield.
Great. Dr. Heimowitz, would you please share a little bit about yourself and your adventures overseas with soybeans?
Yes, I joined the faculty of the University of Illinois in 1967. Previous to that, I spent a year in India as a Fulbright scholar and learned quite a bit about poverty and about the fact that there is a shortage of food in many parts of the world. I also spent a year or two, rather, in Brazil. Same thing, same story. However, in both countries, I worked to develop a soybean program that could increase production and help feed their own population. The same thing in the United States. I was heavily involved in very early soybean research, dealing with the changing of genetically changing various parts of the soybean to improve its nutritional quality. And for the past several years, I've been retired and finishing off my research and hopefully make a contribution to humankind.
Great. This is a great segment. What is genetically modified organisms? Can you give us a simple definition so that our viewers will know what it means and how it's applied?
Are you referring to me?
It doesn't matter, whoever wants to go first.
Well, Dr. Moose can do a pretty good job, I think.
Okay, I'll take a crack at it. Genetically modified organisms, so that term, it actually, in a general way, sort of refers to almost all of our crop and livestock, crop varieties and livestock, in that we have changed genes that were in wild species through selective breeding for centuries, maybe since the dawn of agriculture. More recently, it's been attached to the use of molecular biology, genetic engineering technologies in the laboratory, where pieces of DNA can be basically copy and pasted and edited in a way like you would do edit text in a word processor.
Okay. So
I would agree with Dr. Moose, but I would extend it further. Not only is it for crops, but also bacteria and other organisms, which may be useful for example, drugs. Insulin that people take for diabetes is a modified product from bacteria, and other types of drugs may be modified to assist various human conditions.
thank you. One other definition, could you please explain biotechnology?
I can give you the one that I use in my class.
Sounds good. That'll work.
And this comes from the U.S. Congress. It's any product or process or material that uses biological organisms to make a product. So inherent in that is using science for application and a product, meaning it's sold. So unless you're selling something, you're probably not necessarily doing much biotechnology, I guess, is implicit in the definition.
All right. So, can you give us a brief process of how GMOs are created?
I think I can give a quick overview of that. So to start with, where do the genes come from? Where do we get the ideas? So all of that comes from nature. We have this tremendous diversity of genetic change and genetic variation, whether it's in all variety of organisms. And so we observe some trait that would be useful. And then it would be nice to transfer that trait to another organism. And before, we were limited to do this by crossing, sexual reproduction. But now we have, again, we can co-opt natural strategies that some organisms already use in nature to transfer DNA, say, from a bacteria to a plant, and then make that plant make the food that I need. And so scientists have co-opted that process of DNA transfer to transfer essentially any DNA to a plant cell. And then there are other similar kinds of methods that have been used for animal or livestock. And in some cases, rather than using a biological process, you can do a brute force method where you just insert the DNA into a cell, and at some frequency, it will be incorporated into the genome or the DNA of that cell. Then once you have a cell that has the new DNA in the genome, then there's a process in plants, which is very similar to what we would do when you take a cutting and root it and make a new plant. That process can be then done to take a whole cell, one cell, and regenerate it into a new plant. In the case of livestock, then that usually it's an egg that's the DNA is inserted into, and then that would be implanted in a surrogate mother.
Yeah, I might add that it's doing gene transfers such as he's describing is something that's done all the time in laboratories. It's one of the main tools of molecular biologists to discern what genes do or don't do and how they interact. So it's very common technology. The thing that's not too many of those things actually go to market. They're not intended to go to market. So the GMO crops that everybody knows about is just a few of the many things that have been done in the labs to help us understand biology.
So you mentioned some of these genetic modifications don't necessarily go commercial. Is that what you're saying? And
Very few.
And then what's the purpose of actually having all this research done if it's not being applied?
Well, it's a tool. A lot of research uses mice or bacteria or yeast or many of the model organisms, worms, flies, and it's very common to modify those organisms just for the purpose of doing research, so that as he was talking about, you insert a particular trait that you want, or you take out a trait you don't like, and those can be very useful in biological research. So this is a well understood technology.
So from my research,
I think a very a simple way to say it is, we use the technology to understand what genes do, and the best way to understand how a gene functions is to either knock it out, reduce its function, or pump it up. And the biotechnology processes allow us to do that very easily and specifically. So then we understand how genes work better.
Dr. Heimowitz, would you like to chime in?
Well, I agree with both of the previous speakers about biotechnology and what we try to do. I agree with that.
With that, I'm really wanting to know, and maybe the average person doesn't know, how long does it take to create a GMO, and then eventually, how long is the trial period before reaching the consumer? Is it a 90-day window? Is it over a period of years? What is that process, and how does it look like?
I think you need to separate the science of what gene do we need or how do we need to modify, separate that from then the very long commercialization process. Okay. Because it's a routine, almost daily thing for somebody doing research to say, well, I want to change this organism in this way so I can do this study. But taking that from the laboratory bench to commercial product is something that is a long time coming.
I think that the experiments that would be used to, say, create a genetically modified plant or animal even would be on the range of a 6-month to maybe year at most process. And then there's an extensive testing that happens. First in the greenhouse, if we're talking about plants, maybe a small scale in the greenhouse, then possibly in the field on a small scale, and then we graduate up to progressively larger tests to the point that if it was to be commercialized, it would be tested for probably at least 5 years and on many, many acres of trials throughout the country to evaluate what its performance might be. And all during that time, information's being collected that would be used to present to the government regulatory bodies how this crop performs, what its interaction with the environment is, potential food safety issues. So it's a pretty lengthy process. That going from a lab idea to a commercial product would be on the range of 10 to 15 years.
Dr. Heimowitz, do you have anything to say? Thank you,
yes,
Dr. Moose.
It really, Dr. Moose is correct. It takes a long time. However, there are other circumstances which help promote the commercialization of a GMO crop. For example, papaya in Hawaii. There's about 1,000 acres, somewhere around there, of papaya in Hawaii. The papaya that was grown there was highly susceptible to a pathogen, and the crop was just about outdoomed from the acreage in Hawaii. However, through GMO, a gene for resistance to this particular pathogen was inserted into papaya, and it quickly became available commercially. Otherwise, there would be no papaya in Hawaii. So it depends on the degree of severity of the problem. If it's either get it in there or you lose a whole crop, as opposed to we wish to have certain due to government regulations. It can take a long time to make sure that the crop is both nutritional or it meets all government regulations as far as growth is concerned, and also it competes properly or regularly with the crops that are currently grown, the varieties currently grown. Farmers do not grow GMO crops just because they're GMO. They grow them because they have a trait that makes it more efficient for them, and they make more money. So that the fact that there's a GMO crop, that does not make it necessarily commercially feasible.
Yeah, I might add that there's a large number of organisms that have had successful, at least in a trial, very successful modifications made. There's, I don't know, maybe 17 or more varieties of rice. They're available, but they're not commercialized yet, and they can go on for decades. Golden rice, which has obvious nutritional benefits, has not been brought to market yet because of various issues, not relating to the plant, so to say, but to customer acceptance.
Well, I think the other thing is that it's just like a great controversy of people who are for GMOs and not for GMOs. So I heard Dr. Heimwitz, you said farmers, let me back up. From my research, I found 10 GMOs that are commonly grown: corn, soybean, sugar, aspartame, which is a form of sugar, papayas, which Dr. Heimwitz has discussed, canola, cotton, zucchini, and yellow squash. And now there's a new GMO product that's going to occur. It's called the Arctic apple, and that's specifically for reducing browning. So now, is that more of an aesthetic goal than really feeding people? I'm curious what your perspective is on that.
The Arctic apple is one of those things that is really exciting, the potential, because what it's going to do, and for a lot of these plants that have that type of modification, they have longer shelf life. The grocers are going to throw away less food. There's going to be less food lost to rotting because of transportation time. So it's possible that those kind of modifications will save us a lot of food that's being thrown away now.
So some people is there anyone else who would like to comment on that?
If the apple doesn't taste very well, but yet has this modification in it, who's going to buy it? It has to meet the competition of apples currently being sold in the supermarket, or else it'll go by the wayside. A brilliant idea, but if it doesn't meet the taste of the consumer, forget about it.
Yeah, I agree with what was said, but also would add that this is a trait that will be a direct, observable value to the consumer. And many of the traits that have been engineered so far have been directed at farmers because the companies that develop them, that's their customer, are farmers. Monsanto, Pioneer, Syngenta, they sell seed to farmers. They don't sell products in the grocery store. But the Arctic apple, can go from an orchard to a store directly to the consumer, and they can see then the value and the benefit of the genetic modification, which in this case is basically just turning off a gene that's already there. There's a gene there that causes the browning, and that's a defense reaction against being munched on by an insect. And so this technology will stop that normal defense, and the benefit to that would be longer shelf life, possibly even some advantage in the growing of the plants themselves. in that they won't be softened in the field by insect attack.
Well, the Flavor Saver tomato was one of the earliest GMOs that was brought to market, and yet ultimately it was taken off the market. And there was that was a case where there was at least a palatable benefit to the consumer in terms of the texture and freshness of the tomato. What's your take on why Flavor Savers did not succeed as a commercial crop?
The answer is price.
Price?
They were selling it at $5 a pound.
Oh, yeah, that would discourage me.
Yeah.
Who's going to buy tomatoes at $5 a pound?
That's
Yeah,
fair.
and another
commercially, it
factor
wasn't
that
successful.
happened there was the company that developed it, Calgene. They were bought by Monsanto, and again, as I mentioned, Monsanto at that time wasn't selling to grocery stores, so they didn't really have a good handle on that end of the business, and so there were distribution problems and such that just because they were in a business they weren't experts in. And so there was a lot of demand, but then when the product supply couldn't meet the demand, people sort of, got tired of waiting for it, and in the end, it was just discontinued.
Do you think that was because the people that were actually selling the apples thought they had a product that was worth more than the customers did, or what was the reason for the high price other than just taking advantage of the situation?
I think it was, so the Flavor Saver was developed, actually Campbell Soup Company was the ones who started it, and the goal was to improve the shelf life, if you will, the harvest window on processing tomatoes. The intention wasn't to do direct marketing, but then Campbell's pulled out of the project, and they tried to make a go of it through direct marketing, but really the varieties that were used weren't even the kind that you would grow in your garden. They were the kind that you would grow if you were a big tomato processor. And so they really didn't, there was a combination of things that led to, if they had to do it over again, I'm sure they would have thought through these things a little more.
Yeah, it sounds
but
like
in the end, it was Monsanto just wasn't going to be selling vegetables.
Yeah.
It wasn't their core business. So they discontinued it for that reason.
yeah, that sounds like one that the business end of the business dropped the ball and not the science end.
Right, so it's like the
so I think
supply
that's very
chain
true. That's what
and
those
poor
people-
marketing.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Some people would argue that Monsanto, even if they might have lost money on it, they should have stuck with it because the public was interested in it. They did like the product.
Yeah.
this goes into my next question. Dr. Heimowitz, I know you have a soybean background. Dr. Moosh, you have a corn background, molecular biology background. So will cross-pollination affect other non-GMO crops? And if there are two fields next to each other, one GMO and one non-GMO, what is the likelihood of them cross-pollinating?
Well, soybeans are highly inbred as opposed to corn. To separate a GMO soybean from a non-GMO soybean, all you need is probably 10 feet, 9 feet, and that's about it. It's a completely different story with corn. Dr. Moose can discuss that.
Yeah, so corn is wind pollinated, and so the pollen can travel, but as far as wind pollinated crops go, its pollen is quite heavy. So, I don't know, 500 feet is, I think it's actually 660 feet is the isolation distance that the seed companies use to pretty much ensure there's no pollen flow. So, less than a quarter mile distance would typically be enough. And even when it does transfer, the pollen flow would be highest within a very short distance. and it doesn't take very long. You get 100 feet away, and it's going to be very low. It can happen, but it's very low. And you get a quarter mile away, you're basically not going to find pollen flow.
The big problem lies when you have neighbors with one fence between them, and they're both growing corn, fence row to fence row. One's growing GMO corn, the other one's growing non-GMO corn, and the fields are right abut each other, and then they get into a big argument, and eventually it gets into a lawsuit. So that's what you're referring to. But for the commercial production of corn or soybeans, there's hardly any problem because of the distances that are required. What you're referring to is the problem with 2 farmers, 3 farmers growing crops close to each other, and each one wants to, do their thing. The same problem is with not only GMO but also organic farming. If 2 farmers are next to each other and they're growing, one is growing organic crop, the other one's growing non-organic crop, and one is spraying and the spray happens to fall on the other side of the fence, you have, again, an argument and probably a lawsuit. So that's where the major issues lie in the real world, rather as opposed to the commercial company situation.
Thank you. My next question is, some advocates feel that big companies are forcing farmers to grow GMOs. Do you think that that's a trend? I mean, especially small farmers, as you mentioned, Dr. Heimlich, there are small farmers, and this has been in the news with Monsanto, lawsuits against small farmers. This example that you used of pollen falling on another farmer's landscape and Monsanto suing them. Should we be concerned because big corporations are bullying the small farmer? What are some of the things that we could possibly do? What are some solutions that you would suggest to a small farmer?
Well, first of all, I don't think the companies are forcing anybody to buy anything. They sell it because people want it. There's probably some kind of secondary issues that come up when farmers who have lots of acreage and are buying seed that are from Monsanto or whoever, and they're able to make a product a lot more efficiently than somebody who isn't using those products. Well, that kind of leaves a small farmer needing to find creative ways to market their product. It's the big versus small business issue. It's not per se it's Monsanto or it's even that it's GMOs. It's just that small farmers have a very difficult time these days being competitive. But if you look in the seed catalogs, certainly for corn and soybeans both, and some other crops, they're almost all GMO. You can go, if you're a small farmer, you can go somewhere else and buy the seed you want. Monsanto isn't going to tell you have to buy theirs. I'm not really sure there's a problem in that sense.
Is there anyone else that would like to comment?
Well, I would agree with what was said there. Definitely, there's not anyone forcing anyone to buy these. And in fact, if you do buy them, you have to sign an agreement, sort of agreeing that you would use them in the way that, a stewardship agreement. As far as the lawsuits go, there have been situations where pollen has flown, migrated, and a low level of GM has been found in what was desired to be a non-GM crop. Those have never led to a lawsuit. So Monsanto might ask questions because these technologies are patented because of how expensive they are to develop. So, Monsanto would ask questions, but if it was inadvertent mixing or something of that nature, there will be no lawsuit. The only lawsuits that have happened are where farmers have intentionally saved the seed, replanted it, knowingly violating the license agreement that they signed, or not signing one in the first place. So basically, it'd be like pirating music or DVDs. The same thing. I mean, we know, Napster got shut down because they tried to do that. So it's the same kind of laws apply to these seed. And when there have been the lawsuits, it has been situations where a farmer claims it was accidental, but for 5 years they have been spraying their field with herbicide on a crop of seed that they didn't pay for that herbicide tolerance trait. So these have been, we'll call them egregious examples. And in fact, most of the time when this has happened, they brag about it to their farmer friends, and the farmer friends actually rat them out. Hey, I have to pay for that seed. Why do they get it for free and I have to pay, for it every year? So that's the reality of about this sort of lawsuits around big companies going after small farmers. It's small farmers who are breaking the law.
Yeah, I'll add the perspective of perhaps a educated consumer. I would not want to be buying something on the grocery shelf that was due to pirated seed, because you don't know what it is, like you do if they bought a seed from Monsanto, everybody knows what that is. But it's possible the farmer that stole the seed, maybe it's got some other traits mixed in because he bred it before, or whatever scenario you want to think about. The product that comes from that seed that's pirated is not known to be that product. And I would hope that the system would keep that kind of product off the shelf. It might be perfectly good, but there's a chance it's different than what it claims to be.
Yeah, there was actually a Supreme Court case on this in 2013, and they ruled it was a situation where a farmer claimed, that they had. Well, it's a situation where it was clear they had pirated the seed, and they knew they were, but they claimed that they didn't know any better, or it happened accidentally. But it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, basically, you're breaking the law because there's a copyright or a patent around this technology.
I'm very much wanting to know, and probably some of our viewers would like to know as well, the yields. From some of my readings from Monsanto and different journalists and journals that scientists have published in, there's a trend that, like corn, for example, first year there's a high yield, and then over time it decreases. Dr. Moose, since you are in the corn molecular biology field and your work, have you found that trend to be true?
I would guess what they're referring to here is the idea of the hybrid corn. So almost all corn varieties sold today are hybrids, where they cross two good parent lines, but when they cross them, the children, the progeny, are even better than the parents, grow faster, and are more stress tolerant. This is true of many crops, in fact. And so in corn, the whole seed industry is built on this concept of, and this predates any biotechnology or any GMOs. So in the 1930s is when this hybrid seed enterprise really took off, and it led to a five-fold increase in corn yield over the 20th century. And so what happens then is if you were to plant the seed of the children that are more vigorous, those grandchildren will have a mixture of traits from the parents, and they don't have the same level of performance as the child does, the hybrid. And that is true whether it's genetically modified or not. And so if the farmer saves corn seed from a hybrid, or any crop that's a hybrid, so there are hybrid tomatoes, there are all kinds of other hybrid crops, vegetables, in your gardens even, that if you save the seed, they will not be that same type. So that, again, that system's been in place for a long time. Farmers go back every year to buy that seed because it is better, and the plants will grow better.
Dr. Heimowitz, would you like to chime in?
Soybeans is slightly different. Soybeans is a highly inbred crop, and if you take two varieties, one the GMO, in which the genetic trait was inserted into a variety that the farmers normally grow, let's say Roundup or glyphosate. The difference between the two may be not too much. However, the farmer is saving money on not having to go back and forth in the field to spray, and so that the chemicals that the farmer normally would spray are eliminated, and therefore the profit is much higher in the GMO field. However, over the years, Monsanto has done, and other companies have done a pretty good job in developing varieties that have just higher yields. And so over time, we face a situation in where the yields of varieties, both GMO and plain ordinary varieties, the yields are increasing. Not so much as corn, the increase, but they're increasing, a half a bushel or a bushel a year or something like that. But the big situation with the GMO soybeans is that farmers are placing much fewer poundage of chemicals on their fields, and therefore it's a profit motive to grow the GMO traded variety.
Thank you, Dr. Heimowitz. With that question, I have a question in regards to that. You talked about Roundup. There's been studies stating that Roundup causes cancer. How do you justify a GMO with the potential of causing cancer and using different insecticides and pesticides?
A lot of the.
Well, first,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
I was going to say a lot of the more recent uproar about Roundup or whatever causes cancer because of GMOs. A lot of that came from one study that was published in 2012. The paper was later withdrawn. The people that did it received wide criticism for poor science, and there just isn't any evidence that says that these crops cause cancer in any way. There is a question about, well, what is glyphosate? How does it get broken down in the body? Does it interact with anything you don't want it to? And glyphosate is what Roundup is, and it's a small molecule. So okay, it can maybe get through the intestinal wall, maybe not. Maybe it gets broken down, maybe it doesn't. Some of that isn't well understood, but there's been just hundreds and hundreds of papers published that say, no, this stuff does not cause a problem in people. It's just the science isn't there to support it.
Dr. Heimowitz, what would you like to say?
Well, many years ago when I was working in India, I started the Indian soybean program at the University of Illinois. The newspapers came out with a number of articles that pleaded with people not to eat the soybean because the soybean had poisons. And the dean of the College of Agriculture came to me and said, how do you answer that? How do you respond to those people? And so I wrote a letter to the editor stating that corn, wheat, rice, and other crops that humans eat all contain these same anti-nutritional chemicals. However, we do not eat raw rice, raw wheat, raw soybeans. We cook them, we poach them, we boil them, we process it in some way. And in that processing procedure, the anti-nutritional proteins or anti-nutritional parts of the seed are broken down so that the soybean does have some so-called trypsin inhibitors, same with rice, same with corn, but they're broken down. And when a farmer puts on glyphosate, he puts it on when there are no seed around. First of all, it's a planting time, and the possibility of translocation of the glyphosate into the seed is highly remote. Glyphosate breaks down pretty easily into CO2 and water, something like that. And tests, as indicated, tests have shown that there's the remotest possibility of glyphosate in seed. And hundreds of studies have been done on this. Now, as far as the cancer, that was that one study that demonstrated supposedly that it causes it, and then cancer, and then it was refuted. However, let me put the situation in the following way. About 95% of the soybeans grown in the United States today are GMO. There are about, 300 million people in the United States, 315, something like that. I would say that 80 to 90% of the population eats GMO soybean or GMO corn probably every day. And this has been going on. GMO started in 1985. And I know of no studies that have shown that GMO has caused anything in humans. So, on a worldwide basis, we're talking about billions of people. Billions. One may say, what about, we know next year, 2 years, 3 years, what about 30 years from now? Well, as I said, it started in 1985, and now we're at 2015. It's 30 years of an enormous population eating soybeans, corn, and nothing has shown up, and nothing probably will show up. And so the Cassandras against GMO always come up with, well, maybe in 100 years we'll find it, or 200 years. Well, in the meantime, who knows what will happen in 100, 200 years. I won't be around. But in any case, thus far, no known examples have been shown that GMO causes cancer or any other problems in humans. The only issue that I see of GMO problems is that it is possible, and companies are aware of this, that a person who eats maize every day ends up with an allergy to a GMO maize. It's possible. However, the companies are well aware, and the same with soybeans, are well aware of these problems and test these GMO products against just about anything you can imagine. And thus far, we have had no problem. That, to me, is the only possibility of a problem. And the odds are it may never happen, this sort of situation. I'm presenting a scenario of those people who complain about GMOs. They may have problems with the people who have become allergic to a particular crop. That's the only issue I can
Dr. Moose, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I just have two short points. So regarding this, there's a study that says I feed glyphosate or Roundup Ready soybean to rats or mice, and they will form tumors. Okay, that study was flawed, and because every scientific experiment, a good one, should include what's called a positive control, meaning it should have an effect regardless of the treatment, and a negative control, where I don't give a treatment and should see that there is no effect. So in this particular experiment, the mice that were used to do the study were modified, actually, to be predisposed to cancer. They're used as a positive control in studies where either we're trying to see if a drug can, treat cancer, or we want to do a treatment and we want to make sure, we can see tumors so we know that the experiment worked properly. So this scientist used rats already predisposed to forming tumors and found that when I feed them GM soybean, they form tumors. Well, of course they did, because they already were going to, regardless of what they ate. Okay, so that's why that study, even though it's been widely publicized and debated and put out there by organizations who are opposed to the use of GMOs, it was a flawed study for that reason. I think most people would understand why that is a problem. And then the other point I would make is about the food safety and where the risks are. So there are risks, but they're very remote. And one group that might really care if there was an issue eating GMOs, that people were going to die or at least be sick, would be health or life insurance companies. If people start getting sick or dying, they're going to have to pay out. So they have done study. They have looked into this. They have basically, the life insurance companies want to know, if people are going to start dying or not. They've looked into it and they find there's no evidence whatsoever that there's an increased risk of eating GM food. They do assign a risk of paying out if there's a supernova, because it's known they can happen. And if you're on the wrong side of the planet, the dark side, when it hits, your insurance company may pay out on the other side of the planet. So as remote and sort of goofy as that sounds, they have actually assigned a probability to a supernova, but they can assign no probability to eating GM foods, because there's never even been a single case of indigestion or sniffles from eating a GM food product.
I might clarify on the allergy issue. It wouldn't have anything to do with being a GMO plant that you're allergic to. You're just either going to be allergic to something or you're not. And depends on a lot of random genetics in the individual that's eating the food as to whether or not they would see or experience an allergy. Wouldn't have anything at all to do with whether it's a GMO. Yeah, maybe some protein produced by that GMO might be the thing you're allergic to, but it wouldn't have had to have been a GMO to do that. Just if you run into that protein, you have an allergy. Well, yeah, it's a rare occurrence. Certainly can't hold GMOs responsible for that. That's just being allergic to something in your environment. Yeah.
So this goes into a couple more questions I have. I want to make sure. So from our corn and soybeans, corn-derived food additives are xanthium gum, modified cornstarch, dextrose, citric acid, monosome glutamate, MSG. And for soybeans, we can find that in mayonnaise, margarine, salad dressing, non-dairy coffee flavor, canola, and cottonseed. For frying, deep frying potato chips and other products. Is that correct? Is that some of the GMOs that we're consuming?
There's probably hundreds of products you haven't even mentioned, both on corn and soybeans. Hundreds. All you have to do is, and I've done this before, is go to a local supermarket and start looking at the labels. And you'll be amazed about the number of products that have corn or soybean labeled soybeans growing in the United States are GMOs. So the chances are that when you go to the supermarket and look at the labels, and you see a soybean, you know GMO has been there. But no one has ever had indigestion because of, as I say, GMO product. The same with corn. Hundreds of products contain corn or corn derivatives.
Yeah, everything with high fructose corn syrup, which is almost everything. Yeah.
Dr. Moose?
Well, I was just going to say that that protein and DNA, which some people might have a problem with, or what they would attribute to being different in a GM versus non-GM, and this is part of the reason why they're not viewed as a very high-risk product, is as soon as they hit our saliva and our stomach, they're degraded into their amino acids and bases that are nutrition. That's what our body does. It's what our digestive system does. So that's if I actually eat like a raw soybean or a raw corn. So the only raw soybeans you might encounter would be edamame or maybe tofu. In corn, it would be like tortilla chips or a taco shell, direct corn. That's low probability that you actually encounter that. My point being that most of the food is processed, and the heating and the processing that's done will also destroy most proteins to the point they're not an issue anymore. So our actual exposure to a gene or a protein is very low, because also we're changing one gene, and there might be 50,000 genes in a soybean or a corn plant. So, if you do the math and sort of think about how diluted this one gene becomes in our actual diet, it's 1/1,000,000th of the material that we're eating could even possibly be offending. And even then, it's something that we're pretty comfortable with, our digestive system can handle.
So, would you like to mention anything, Mr.
Just to
Roy?
reinforce this last point, our digestive systems are set up so that we can't take into our bloodstream a protein. It has to be chopped up. It only can enter the cells of the lining of the gut and go on into the blood if those proteins are broken down into 2 or 3 amino acid units at most. So it's kind of like, say, you're going to build a house out of used brick. You get the used brick. Do you care where it came from? No. They're all the same. Whatever they were used for before has no relevance on the fact they're a brick that you can use now. Same thing, I don't care what kind of protein you get from a plant or a lipid or a carbohydrate. Those things all have to be chopped up into their components before you can actually digest them and get use out of them. So I'm very careful with the fact that I don't care what GMO you give me, it's not going to affect me because my body's going to chop it up before I use it.
So the average consumer, because pretty much the whole table has a background in some form of science, but the average consumer probably would look at it like, what am I eating? Is this Franken food? Should I be really scared? Is the organic or heirloom seeds is better for me? I think, what would you tell a consumer that's very frightened about the idea of eating GMOs?
Well, what I would say is, all food is GMO effectively. I mean, there's been an effort to describe GMOs as something different and unnatural, and that's just not the case. We are taking things we observe in nature and combining them in a little different way. But all the things that we're doing is we're informed by nature. So that's one thing I would say, and I guess, the way I would describe it, we do use technology to improve agriculture, and we've done this, it's part of the human condition. And so, just like, people who do writing now, they use a laptop and a printer, laser printer. We're not going to go back to a typewriter and ribbons and, paper. which was not that long ago. That was the main way you typed out a document. And so technology advances, and it's building on what we're already comfortable with. And GM technology is very much like that. We can do these genetic changes better, more flexibly, design things like this Arctic apple. I mean, we just basically took out a gene that was there that's useful to the plant in some scenarios, but not very useful when I'm going to market an apple in a grocery store. And so we can, by science, make that one change and have the benefit to the consumer and no penalty to growing the plant. I mean, that's kind of it's a pretty interesting and nice thing to think about, I guess. So I guess, what I would say to a consumer that's concerned is that we're not really doing anything different. There are a lot of watchful eyes, scientists, experts, who are looking out for the unexpected, risky, possibly damaging thing. The companies who develop these products, they have a lot on the line. I mean, no company wants to sell a product that would poison or get anyone ill, because that would be, probably the end of that company. So, if you have that understanding, then, obviously you can't expect all society to understand all the details of biotechnology and even agriculture, but there should be some element of confidence that, your food supply is safe. And I think most people in the United States, for sure, have this opinion. If you actually want to be concerned about things, we know in the last few years there have been documented deaths and illnesses from organic. Absolutely have been pinned to practices in organic production. So if you really want to talk about concern about what I'm eating, that might be, heirloom varieties. Some of them are, there's an heirloom variety of potato that will poison you. We bred out that problem in more modern potatoes. So, I think people need to really understand, they don't understand the history of agriculture for sure and where we are now. And then, you throw on something like the complex science around biotechnology, and it does get confusing. And so then you have very active people putting out misinformation that confuses the public, and that's why we're having this conversation basically right now.
Thank you, Dr. Moose. Do you have anything to say, Dr. Heimlitz?
Well, you're talking to me in South Florida. You all are up for the north. I have a garden where I live, and this year I decided to show my friends what an heirloom tomato looks like. And I have a whole bunch of cherry tomatoes and grape tomatoes growing, and then I have a couple plants of heirloom tomatoes. Well, the heirloom tomatoes are slower growing than what I have. They look ugly. They're all crinkled. And I showed people this is the difference between what the breeders have done today, and this is what the tomatoes looked like 50, 60, 70 years ago. So the breeders are constantly looking for traits to improve the products. They are the crop itself. These are domesticated plants. They are changing just like we change. And the crop evolves. And those people who are GMO Luddites, or they advocate all sorts of things that are not really true, have individuals who follow them, usually are those that lack scientific education, or just close their eyes and say, it can't happen, something is wrong. This is a serious matter. There are several countries in Europe which do not permit GMO products. And number of companies have left, at least one big one has left Europe, come to the United States, because they feel that there's no point in them doing research where they cannot grow crops, GMO crops out, because they'll be mobs of people will disturb them, rip out their crops and so forth. So they've come to the United States. It's unfortunate. This has come to the point where countries have actually stopped the importation of these GMO products, growing of GMO products, and it's a sad story because I don't know how humans could feed themselves if we went back to the old ways.
Thank you. So we've been talking specifically about corn and soybean as a raw product. How does that impact livestock? I mean, once it's most of our livestock eat corn and soybeans, and so the question becomes: are we impacted by the GMOs once the food is in production or harvested as a form of meat or milk? Should we be concerned?
Absolutely not, for the reasons we already discussed.
Okay.
They have a digestive system too. They digest these products into their nutrients. They absorb the nutrients, and we then harvest these animals for their meat and dairy. We eat plants all the time. They have genes for chlorophyll. Plants are green, but when we eat a plant, we don't turn green. When we eat a tomato, we don't turn red. Or we eat a banana, we don't turn yellow. So neither do the animals. So that notion that it somehow would be carried on, again, our digestive systems and those of animals are very good at breaking these compounds down into nutrition. That's why we eat protein.
Any more comments?
Well, we found out pretty early in biotechnology studies, DNA is DNA is DNA. It doesn't make a difference whether it's a human DNA or animal DNA. It acts very similarly. And thus, similarly, with feeding plant material to animals, we break it down and they break it down. So that we're all acting in a similar fashion. And thus far, nothing has been shown to affect poultry, which is the greatest use of it. As far as soybeans are concerned, about 50%, something like that, of our poultry. That's where most of our soybeans go to. The major problem actually is not GMO with our nutrition of our animals. It's actually the feeding them of various chemicals for growth factors and also for resistance, to make them resistant or to ensure they grow healthy. And we may be over dosing the animals so that that dosage stays in the meat. But that has nothing to do with GMO.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moose, Dr. Heimowitz, Mr. Roy Williams, for coming on Live Free TV. We will continue this discussion, but at this time, I hope you all have a great day and been informed about some great information about GMOs. Have a great evening.